Sandra?
All right, well, welcome everybody to the next in our webinar series of the Canadian Shelter Transformation Network. I'm going to do a quick introduction. My name is Sandra Clarkson. I am the CEO of the Calgary Drop-In Center and also co-chair of the Canadian Shelter Transformation Network. So thanks for coming here today. We'll move on to our land acknowledgement. And from coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. We recognize the historic and ongoing impacts of colonization and are committed to decolonization of our systems and ongoing reconciliation, guided in our work by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action, the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Calls to Justice, and the Principles of Empowerment and Self-Determination. So we'll move on to some housekeeping items, just so everybody understands how things will work today. So please mute your computer. You can ask questions at any time using the chat function. The webinar and the slides will be posted on the CSTN website afterwards for you to return to or share. And we hope to take about 75 minutes of your time today. So the Canadian Shelter Transformation Network was originally formed in 2019. It was really meant to be build a network and a movement actually across the country around changing the way emergency shelters function to becoming housing focused and truly be an engine to ending experiences of homelessness and really see emergency shelter as a process, not a destination. And since that time, we've been able to do a lot. We had to pause through COVID, unfortunately, but now with the addition of Grant Martin, who you will meet shortly, we've got some momentum happening again. So how the network can help support the work, very important work that you're doing. We've got a number of different pieces of work happening and open source resources on the website as well. So encourage you to spend some time there and look at what's available, and also to ensure that you're registering for the series of webinars. We will also be at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness Conference in Ottawa this year. Got a couple of sessions as well as a booth. So encourage you to come and chat with us. And we really want to guide towards action by aligning to some of the processes, shelter guests to have an expectation of some type of common standard of practice, no matter where they present for shelter, and similar expectations of the goals of that shelter stay ultimately is what we're trying to achieve through all of our work. And the outline for today, we've got a guest here joining us who I'll speak to in just a moment, and really look forward to sharing some of the pieces around service orientation considerations, questions, and then really talking about what's next in the research project that's currently underway with the University of Calgary, org code, the Calgary Drop-In Center, and we'll give you more details on that. So now I will move to introducing our presenters. Tessa Blakey Whitecloud comes to Siloam Mission from One Just City, where she served as executive director. She holds a degree in sociology and a master's in political economy. As CEO of Siloam, she's made significant changes, including transitioning the organization to being housing-focused, behavior-based, and data-driven. Siloam's new vision is a Winnipeg without chronic homelessness, and the housing strategy aims to create 700 to 1,000 units of social housing in the next decade. For Tessa, partnering and collaborating with other organizations is key to helping those experiencing homelessness. Welcome, Tessa, and thanks for joining us here today. And Grant received at King's University College at Western University in London, Ontario. Over the past 20 years, he's held various management, planning, and direct service positions, supporting individuals and families experiencing homelessness and impacted by poverty, mental health, and addiction. His goal is to end homelessness across Canada and is relentless in his pursuit to achieve this goal. Thank you, Grant. With that, I will turn it over to you and Tessa.
Thank you, Sandra. And then just so people know kind of a bit of the format today, we'll be reviewing, I'll be kind of reviewing each service orientation element one at a time, and then developing or sharing some practical ways of implementing that. And then Tessa will be able to share her experiences of how they've been able to introduce some of these pieces into their work at their shelter. But before we move into that, I thought that maybe Tessa, you could give a bit of a background on Salome, just so people kind of know where you're coming from.
Yeah, for sure. So Salem Mission is a emergency shelter in Winnipeg that you can kind of see some of the stats on the screen. So we have a big impact in terms of those we reach to support with food insecurity. In our overnight space, we have 146 beds. But we also have 110 permanent supportive housing units and 20 transitional housing units. So as mentioned in my introduction, we've pivoted to becoming housing focused, but recognize in Winnipeg, that's actually really difficult. We only have about a third of the social housing stock of cities like Calgary. So we have 3 units for every 20 low income people, whereas at last count, Calgary had 9, Regina has 8. So part of our pivot is to build more supportive housing for folks and more low income housing. We're really lucky, though, to have a wide array of holistic services that people can access. So that includes a medical clinic, a clothing store that's free, a hygiene program, laundry, wellness programming on site. That includes both Christian and Indigenous spiritual practices and traditions. We also, are just about to open a houseware store where people can kind of shop when they're getting housed, again, for free from donated stuff. We have supportive employment. So that's employment for folks that are accessing services to try to support them to reduce barriers to employment and to move into housing. And then, of course, like all spaces, we have casework teams. Not all spaces, but like lots of spaces, we have casework teams. And so we have teams that do housing loss prevention. Actually, we'll be presenting on that at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness Conference if you want to check that out. Rapid rehousing. When we have caseworkers who support folks who are experiencing homelessness under 6 months, because then they don't qualify for the coordinated access system in Winnipeg until they've reached that 6-month mark. And then we have caseworkers who are connected to that system for once folks exceed the 6 months experience of homelessness. One of the things that's sort of unique for us and might be a challenge that other people have when they go through changes organizationally, like what we've done, is bringing your donors and your funders along with you. And so Salem Mission is unique in the Winnipeg context in that we are 80% donation funded. And so as we navigated to become behavior-based or low barrier, as we navigated to kind of shift to that housing focus, how we've been bringing our donors along with us is some of what I'll talk about as we move through the service orientation.
Perfect. Thank you for offering that background, Tessa. Um, I try to start many of the webinars in this way of just acknowledging to like the very essential and I think often life-saving role that emergency shelters play in communities. And I think it's a role that's often underappreciated and faces a great deal of pressure from the community and place to solve a lot of other sectors' limitations. And I think I've shared this before, right? It's like someone gets evicted, go to shelter. Getting released from custody, go to shelter. Discharged from hospital with no fixed address, go to shelter. And this has created like tremendous pressure and fatigue on shelters and shelter workers. But I want to just highlight when we're talking about transformational work, it can say like, well, we're already feeling really tired. I don't know if I have the energy to do transformation work. But burnout isn't caused by trying something different. It comes from feeling trapped in the same situation with no foreseeable way out. That's why everything that we're doing at CSTN is about supporting a radical transformation of our emergency shelters across Canada so that staff and the people accessing shelter feel a way out of the current situation. So our coaching content will heavily focus on the elements needed for a shelter that moves from managing homelessness that can look like this image on the left to activities that directly relate to supporting the end of someone's homelessness. Um, but it does require change, and change is hard. And I think throughout the series, I'll be asking attendants how you're feeling and where you find yourself in this transformational change process. Many of you may be on the left side, feeling like there's a need for change because what you're doing isn't resulting in people getting housed from shelter for whatever reason that might be. There could be lots of different feelings like confusion, like I don't know what these changes will be and how it will impact me. You could also have feelings of anxiety and loss because potentially you've been doing this work in a particular way for a long time, or a loss of the relationships you might have with some shelter guests. For instance, Grant has been here so long and I like seeing Grant and he helps around the shelter. Or lost because I don't know if this change is the type of work I signed up to do when I started working in shelters. These are all very real feelings. But hopefully, you'll move through these feelings and be able to start to create some clarity around a new vision and direction for a new shelter model and bring everybody on board. So following the webinar, I will send a link to an anonymous quick poll that just asks this simple question. Where do you see yourself in that transitional change continuum or transformational change continuum? Because it helps me understand where people are at, so how to frame these webinars and hopefully be able to get a sense of the pulse of where people are at, and hopefully over time we're moving towards the direction of greater clarity and integration and restructuring. So this is part of a monthly webinar series. In front of you is a table that shows the session topics for about the year to come. These are not set in stone, but there is a progressive or a bit of a linear or sequential order that we want to present these things because they potentially walk through the steps of your shelter processes. So this month is about service orientation considerations, but next month is going to be on designing diversion and intake in your shelter. That's happening on September 25th. All of our monthly webinars happen on the last Wednesday of the month at 12 noon Eastern time. You'll get more information about that when I send out everything from today's session. So an opportunity for you to see what's ahead. So let's jump right into today's topic though, which is about service orientation considerations for emergency shelters. Well, what do we mean when we say service orientation? That really simply is just referring to any organization's focus on really trying to provide excellent service to their participants or guests or whatever preferred language you use. And it really tries to encompass a set of not just attitudes and behaviors, but also strategies that aim at trying to deliver the highest possible quality and person-centered experience for those people that are accessing your shelter. And we want this to look like high quality, not just at certain points within their experience, but from the very first moment of contact with your shelter all the way throughout to positive exit, ideally into permanent housing, because this is the thing that really underpins the work. It's the stuff that says not what we do, not just the technical components, but how we deliver it, right? How are we using a service orientation that is presenting our services with high quality? And so the purpose is for service orientation is multifaceted, right? One is that I think it was already mentioned by Sandra in the introduction is the importance of consistency. When we standardize service orientation, it ensures that all shelters provide a consistent level of care and services, regardless of where they may be in Canada. So whether I'm in Winnipeg or I'm in Windsor, it makes sure that people receiving the service receive high quality and reliable support, no matter which city they show up in. The other is that for accessibility purposes, low barrier shelters really do aim to reduce the obstacles for individuals who find it difficult to find their way into our shelter despite them needing our shelter. So trying to remove obstacles like sobriety requirements or mandatory participation in programs. It doesn't mean that you can't deliver other programs, but they shouldn't be compulsory and they shouldn't get in the way of rehousing efforts. And a standardized service orientation ensures that these shelters are genuinely accessible to those most in need. For efficiency and coordination, right, we talk about standardized services can streamline operations and improve overall coordination amongst the shelters and related services. And this can hopefully lead to better resource allocation, reduce duplication of efforts, and more effective interventions. It allows for greater equity and fairness by establishing clear standards. We ensure that all people receiving the support receive it in a manner that is fair and equitable, regardless of their background or circumstances. It allows us to measure outcomes to see how effective we're being. This data can inform improvements and help secure funding by demonstrating success in areas or needing attention. And the other is really about public trust and support. So when we have consistent and high quality services, it can build public trust, not just with our shelter guests, but also with businesses and residents around our shelter, and greater sense of trust in what low barriers and housing focused shelters are and what value added they are to a community, and becomes really crucial around sustaining that as a program when we have that public trust. So when we're talking about service orientation specifically in emergency shelters, we're talking about these 6 elements: trauma-informed care, harm reduction, culturally appropriate and safe service, person-centered care, compassionate care, and assertive outreach. And these elements are also outlined in the guide that you can find that was developed between CSTN and ORCode in our resources tab. So when we're talking about trauma-informed care, really quickly, we need to know what trauma is, right? We know that trauma is when someone's encountered something that's out of their control and it's a frightening experience and feel disconnected. And trauma-informed shelters really acknowledge around how widespread this is for the experiences of people in our shelters. There are 3 key elements of trauma. One, it was unexpected. The second, the person was unprepared. And third, there's nothing the person could have done to stop it from happening. So we can anticipate, as I mentioned, that this is going to be widespread with the population in our shelters, and they may have experienced things like violence, stigma, loss, both of people and things. So estranged from family and friends, loss of culture, loss of language, and loss of community. And experiencing homelessness is itself traumatic. So we must be sensitive to the traumatic experiences and the impact that it had on the folks that we're supporting in shelter. That really requires us to incorporate the 4 R's, which you can see there, but I really want to highlight too is resisting re-traumatizing someone who's already experienced trauma. So a trauma-informed perspective views trauma-related symptoms and behaviors as an individual's best and most resilient attempt to manage or cope with or try to rise above their experience of trauma, right? So what really resonated with me is when someone said, you know, behaviors we don't seem to understand are potentially an adaptive strategy to a trauma event the person has experienced that they just haven't made us aware of yet. So therefore, things like compliance-based sheltering tends to be less successful in supporting individuals impacted by trauma, because they're essentially saying, you know, act the way I tell you to in order for me to provide what you need, right? However, we know that you are more likely to be successful in making changes to your shelter to meet the needs of its guests than expecting your guests to change in order to meet the needs of your shelter. So let's just keep that in our minds. As hard as changing our shelters might be, it's still not as hard as expecting people to change who they are in order to meet our shelter needs. So shelters unintentionally can re-traumatize people by touching their bodies through things like pat-down searches. So staff should really never touch guests unless it's for first aids or CPR or other life-saving measures. We could unintentionally re-traumatize people by barring them, especially if it could have been prevented through some more effective crisis de-escalation strategies, or doing things like encouraging service modifications as alternatives to barring in your shelter. So this can include things like limiting or customizing hours of access, taking breaks or walks, or having quote unquote cooling stations. Like, I know I need to cool down. Replicating social control measures from other institutions that may have traumatized them. For instance, does our shelter feel and look and replicate too much the detention center that the person just came from, where they experienced some traumatic event? Harsh disciplinary practices, and then yes, designing spaces similar to other systems. And the last one, and I bold it because I think it's one that happens too often, is we've conditioned people to feel like the only way that they'll get the help that they need is by telling their story, when we know that oftentimes unnecessarily telling your story in the wrong setting with the wrong purpose can re-traumatize people. So we don't want people to tell their story if we're not equipped to handle the impact. And if it's not related to how it's going to help them be rehoused and feel heard around that rehousing process. So practical ways to deliver trauma-informed services in shelter. One is we can start with looking at space considerations. So clear signage, consistent and predictable layout to reduce anxiety, ease of maintenance through durable materials and ventilation in high traffic areas. When it comes to common areas, you can design communal spaces that encourage positive social interaction while allowing for personal space to continue to exist. You can also include comfortable seating arrangements that promote conversation. When it comes to resource rooms, you can provide rooms for activities and therapy and resources, including access to computers or housing search assistance and educational materials around that stuff. You can consider accessibility and flexibility of space for varying abilities of your guests or cultural sensitivities for your guests. So designated space for all views space and avoid one specific religious or cultural view. Have safe, calming, neutral colors in your shelter, natural and soft lighting. And you may want to consider some soundproofing considerations or some opportunities for privacy when people need that, including things like where they sleep and in washrooms. We want to do things like avoid judgment. So really that from that previous slide of moving away from what's wrong with you to what happened means also what's working and how do we use more of that in our goal setting and task completion. So you can be more trauma-informed by adopting a more strength-based approach as opposed to one that looks at people as a series of deficiencies. So don't be quick to assume motivation isn't there, but rather things like, did we consider, are these things important to the individual, and is it being completed in a way that works for them? We also want to look at creating emotional and physical safety and trustworthiness. So give people full and accurate information about your shelter and the services that you provide. Being clear and simple in your language is essential. Telling people they have more control than they really do will eventually destroy that trust, unfortunately. So for example, calling a program peer run when it maybe is not can erode trust. You want to openly share your confidentiality policies with your new guests and what your duty to report is. You want to be authentic as a form of protecting themselves. Over time, I think that people who've experienced trauma have a really big capacity to read other people's emotional states. So you do need to be authentic when you're engaging with folks and pick up on your own nonverbal cues. But you also want to help them with being able to build connections outside of shelter. Because we'll hear people say, if I leave the shelter, I'll have no community. Or you can ask them, are there people in your life that you can depend on that are not paid staff? Intentionally making connections with peer supports in or outside of the shelters, reconnecting with natural sports like friends or family, if it's safe and appropriate, will only help them that much more when they leave shelter and feel like they're more prepared for that. And lastly, I think that to incorporate trauma-informed care into your shelter is really to be a big proponent of choice. right? So choice and voice around determining the type, duration, and frequency of the supports that they receive. So work with the guests in the process of kind of accessing, securing, and moving into housing that really allows choice. And so this idea of like, we don't do things for or to shelter guests, we co-create with shelter guests. And so Tessa's now going to share a little bit around how they were able to introduce some of these things into Siloam.
Yeah, so one of the things that was really important for us when we wanted to make this change, so Siloam, we're in Winnipeg, and we were one of the, at that time, only sober required spaces. And we wanted to make the change to make sure we were more fully accessible to everybody. So a big part of this was recognizing that substance use can be a response to trauma, and that especially with harsh winters in Winnipeg, it didn't make sense to have available beds that people could access because of their substance use. But we wanted to make sure that that change kind of came from the community themselves. And so we have a great team here that really led this work and had been doing it before I came in terms of how we talked to community about change and transformation, and how we could lay the groundwork with community to make the switch to behavior-based. So for us, our behavioral expectations are a way that we practice being trauma informed, because instead of maybe a really lengthy list of rules, or really unclear expectations, we built these with community and with support from an agency that does that locally, up, and with the staff to be safe, to be respectful, and to be focused on needs. And so that means needs that we actually meet here at the shelter. So for us, this part of the trauma-informed piece was really to try to lean into the research that says if people kind of know the expectations of a space, neurologically, that's already going to be calmer for them. But also, it's not, in one situation, something might be safe or respectful, and in another situation, it might not be. So rather than saying, well, in this space, here's all the rules, and if you're in, the clinic, here's all of the rules, instead it's, hey, in this space, this is what safe and respectfulness looks like. And the team working with folks has sort of scripted and prepared responses when somebody's making a decision that might be less safe or less respectful, to say, hey, could we offer you this choice as a safer choice? Or could we offer you this way to talk about what's happening for you that's more respectful? So for us, when we're thinking about that trauma-informed piece, we've incorporated training for folks. We've made sure that people understand substance use as related to trauma, and making sure that we're doing that work to reduce stigma for folks and open up to a lack of judgment around substance use in our space. So one of the things that was really interesting is that when we made this shift, one of the things we maybe didn't prepare for as much was how many people who had actually been using services for a really long time, sort of able to maintain an appearance of sobriety, but who would start to talk to us about their substance use now and get into detox and other supports if that was the journey that they were looking for, who never felt comfortable talking to us about their need for a recovery journey before, because it would have in the past prohibited them from accessing services. So one of the pieces of being trauma informed is really making sure that, we talked already about equity, but we're recognizing the needs of the broader community we're working in, and we're responding to those needs, and making sure that nobody's being blamed for their substance use, nobody's being blamed for their homelessness. And instead, we recognize these as responses of other systems creating trauma in that person's life, or other events creating trauma in that person's life. And how do we approach them? Really recognizing that every day when we see people in the drop-in and we see people in shelter, we're likely seeing them on one of their hardest days in their life. And how do we put all of their behavior in that lens of recognizing that this isn't them on their best day with their best behavior? And so how do we love them where they're at and support them to choose things that help everyone else in the space feel safe and respected? So one of the big shifts for us was as we moved to behavior-based, which some folks talk about as low barrier, but was really wanting to make sure that people understood why we were making that move. And so I often use a Jane versus John story, and they're sort of caricatures of real people that we were serving at the time. John was sober, but came in all the time to create fights, right? And was like looking to agitate people. Whereas Jane, we knew, was actively using meth, but she came in and would clean and smile and As we know, lots of folks when they're using meth have that cleaning instinct. And so she was actually a really wonderful presence in the drop-in. Under the old rule system, it was sort of like John was allowed and Jane might not be allowed. What was happening was our staff are so compassionate and loving is that they were letting Jane in anyway. And then that also created more confusion for folks. Well, isn't the rule that you have to be sober? So it didn't lead to psychological calm in the way that now we're creating psychological calm by respectful, by safe, by focused on needs. And so we can meet Jane and John and say, Jane, you can be in this space because you don't have to be sober to be here. And John, actually, we need you to be respectful of others to be in this space. What choices can we help you make to maintain that respectfulness?
Great. Thanks, Tessa. We're going to move into our second element now, which is harm reduction in shelters. And I think actually, as you were speaking, Tessa, I might have put your slide in the wrong order because I think that behavior-based one was supposed to kind of go after this harm reduction, but it's all good. It's all part of the pot. Okay. So when we're talking about harm reduction in shelter, it's referring to any program, practice, or policy designed to reduce drug-related harm without requiring the cessation of drug use, which Tessa kind of touched on. So it's important to note, though, that harm reduction doesn't solely apply to drug use, right? I know it's the one that we talk about the most, but can also apply to other behaviors to have associated risks with it, right? So this can include things like sex work, health-related issues, but also, you know, the various relationships we may have in our lives. Or, for instance, you know, as Tessa kind of mentioned, is like harm reduction can also be practicing how John can find different ways of expressing himself in a more respectful way in that kind of congregate living space. And so practical ways to use a harm reduction approach in shelter can include things like access to harm reduction supplies and disposal stations that might be set up directly in your shelter. You know, you can also do things like instead of touching people or touching people's stuff, you could do self-bag search and have the program or like the shelter guest open their bag for staff and provide visual inspection of contents rather than staff opening the bag and touching their stuff. You could introduce amnesty totes. You could have the availability of naloxone. You could use floor mats for folks that are really, really heavily under the influence and you don't want them to fall from a bed that's lifted up from off the floor. You can have, as I mentioned, the sharps containers and safe supplies. And you can also have people who use substances to review your shelter policies and procedures to see how aligned it is with really practical harm reduction strategies for your shelter. Because the next piece is really around being very pragmatic and open in your goal setting, right? So you may want to talk to people while they're in the shelter from like not just harm reduction, but housing and harm reduction is to talk about conversations that can include like things like budgeting for substance use. So how do I spend related to my drugs and still cover rent? I may not be able to get drugs for free, but there are other things like food and clothes I can get for free. So it creates overall household savings. You could, you know, do goal setting that looks at safe use spaces, structure, and routine in their day for their substance use and helping to address hazards related to their substance use that might be some blind spots that they might have and bringing it to their attention and then putting in place some clear protective factors for those blind spots. You want to explicitly acknowledge your acceptance of their choices. And I'm going to emphasize that again, is to be very explicit. We don't want to avoid the conversation because that suggests that there's something immoral or wrong with it, which you know, may unintentionally create the sense of judgment and not acceptance of their use. And so as Tessa kind of mentioned too, you're focusing on the behavior, not on the use itself. And I love that you shared the example there of a whole bunch of people actually came out after when you used a more behavior-based approach to say, oh, I was actually actively using before. I was just not presenting like I was under the influence. So we can actually have more real conversations. But also too, I would say, when you focus on the behavior and not the use, if you can't tell that someone is under the influence without testing them, then it's not worth the test, right? So clearly their use is not presenting a problem. And so Tessa can talk a little bit then around what they did specifically at Salome around incorporating some of these harm reduction strategies.
Yeah, and I'll just speak to, I think when we think about trauma-informed and we think about harm reduction, like there's such a close Venn diagram. And as is with so much of these service orientation pieces. So for us, that move to behavior-based, could have landed here, but also landed with being trauma-informed, because we're recognizing that people need that calm, consistent environment as much as possible. Like it's not calm all the time, to be fair. We have lots of people in the space and it can be loud, but how do we make sure that we're consistent in our expectations across our team? But what some of the switches that came with switching to behavior-based, our clinic now offers safe use supplies. We have caseworkers who also offer safe use supplies. We for sure saw a skyrocketing amount of drug poisonings, and the work that we're doing to reverse those went up. And at the same time, referrals to detox, which I've already mentioned. We also wanted to make sure that as much as we could, we were reducing systems harm. So we did a lot of work across the entire organization to be housing focused. And when Grant was mentioning being person-centered earlier, part of this was also being position-centered and how we talked about becoming housing-focused and behavior-based as an organization. So behavior-based understanding and training is happening for everybody. Like the cleaners have done that training. It's not just folks that are direct with communities, so that everybody has that same understanding, and same with housing focus. So how do we understand homelessness itself to be a harm, and that we can change by reducing the length of time that somebody is experiencing it? We introduced housing focused caseworkers. So before we actually had a gap, we had rapid rehousing and housing loss prevention, and then we had after 6 months. But that kind of in between zone wasn't something that we had staff looking at or supporting folks in. So those housing focused caseworkers and housing focused practices across the organization were trying to fill gaps, and recognizing that we need to be able to interact and serve somebody at any stage of their homelessness. So when Grant was talking earlier about how our systems can accidentally be re-traumatizing, to tell somebody, actually, you have to wait until you've been homeless this long to qualify here for coordinated access. How do we make sure that within our system, we're offering an alternative so that they don't need to wait for quality of care? Another big piece, I think, of harm reduction in general was to do the work with our staff. And we were lucky, we had a grant to get a change manager focus on this. And we have a fantastic director of services who really focused on this with their teams, to look at how do we make sure our staff understand why we're moving to harm reduction, why it's best practice, and hopefully come around to feeling confident in this new way of working. So, as we thought about where our staff were in that cycle, we did have some staff who said, actually, I'm going to self-select, but it was minimal for these reasons, as far as we know. And so it was about how do we make sure that staff understand why this transition, and how in everything we're doing, it's about putting the community first, and really following best practice is how we put community first. Let's use the evidence-based research to make sure we're helping people where they are and reducing as much harm as possible.
Great. The third element that we're going to move into now is about culturally appropriate and safe service in shelter. So when we're talking about culturally safe and appropriate services in shelter, we're referring to shelter and support services that are, sensitive to and respectful of and inclusive of the cultural values, practices, and needs of individuals from diverse backgrounds. We know that folks experiencing homelessness are not a homogenous group. There's actually a great deal of diversity. So we want to, when we talk about safe, culturally safe, we're saying these services are really, their aim is to create an environment where people feel understood, right? Where they feel respected and free from discrimination and judgment based on their cultural identity. To say that they may have experienced that outside of the shelter, but we don't want you to experience that inside our shelter. So this involves an understanding and a recognition of the impact of like historical and social contexts, such as colonialism or systemic racism on certain groups. When we talk about appropriate, we're saying we want to align with the cultural values, norms, and practices of the individuals being served as our shelter guests, right? So in essence, these services not only meet the basic needs of shelter and safety, but also actively contribute to the psychological, emotional, and spiritual well-being of individuals by honoring their cultural background. And so practical ways that we can deliver service in this way is to support culturally specific needs. So provide accommodations for religious practices such as prayer rooms or with the flexibility of not for one specific religion, offer specific dietary requirements for both religious and cultural purposes, but also due to physical issues that people might have. You may want to offer resources and support for shelter guests dealing with cultural challenges, like things like translation services or cultural mentoring programs. Um, when we're thinking about using language and communication methods, we want to make sure that we're using that which are familiar and comfortable for our guests. So promote clear and inclusive communication that considers, some of your shelter guests may have language barriers and different communication styles. You want to avoid using jargon or acronyms or references that may not be understood by everyone. And then you want to really find ways to involve culturally knowledgeable staff with diverse representation, right? So establish mentorship programs could be something that can connect shelter guests and staff from different cultural backgrounds. You can encourage diverse hiring practices to reflect a wide range of cultural backgrounds within your team at your shelter. And this will help also with things like maybe ensuring diverse representation in the leadership and decision-making team positions at your shelter. Another thing to consider is safe spaces dialogue and continuous improvement, right? So don't think that just because you're great that you don't have blind spots where you can't get some feedback looping. So you want to create safe spaces where shelter guests can openly discuss cultural issues or experiences of discrimination without fear of retribution, including if some of those experiences came from within your own shelter that you operate. You want to be able to implement feedback mechanisms like maybe you do anonymous surveys to gauge how culturally safe shelter guests feel when they're staying at your shelter and gather suggestions for improvement. You may want to look at least on an annual basis, like doing a review of existing policies and procedures to ensure they accommodate diverse cultural practices, such as religious observances, dress codes, dietary restrictions. And shelter leaders must promote this to be a competency equally important to others required to do this work, right? I think sometimes when we talk about culturally appropriate and safe services, it gets mentioned as an add-on that feels less essential to some of these other elements, but it's equally important. Especially, I think about a lot of folks who sometimes won't even identify in a particular way for fear of what it may mean to them for how they can access a service. And so Tessa will talk a little bit just about what they did at Siloam in regards to this element.
Yeah, and so where Siloam had the most space to grow, we're really lucky to have a beautifully diverse team. But we serve a predominantly Indigenous population in Winnipeg. And so it was with our services towards Indigenous folks that we had the most space to grow when we started looking at transforming our service orientation. So actually prior to my time at Siloam, I'm coming up on 3 years, the Siloam leadership worked with an Indigenous consultant to help us set a truth and reconciliation strategy for the organization. That included hiring a director of Indigenous relations so that we had that representation at the leadership team. That person's now called our director of community wellness. We created then from that strategy a commitment to truth and reconciliation with leadership and have an Indigenous advisory council that offers leadership to both operations and governance. So really important for us was the education for staff to better understand the history of colonization and the present of colonization and how that's impacting Indigenous folks and leading to more of them accessing our services, and that overrepresentation has to do with systematic oppression and government interference in Indigenous people's health and wellness. So a big piece of this for us was really wanting to make sure that our space and that our programming that we were offering recognized and valued the Indigenous folks coming through the door. So we built an Indigenous cultural space in our drop-in. This was guided by knowledge keepers and in consultation with community in its design, making sure that it had that ventilation that we needed for smudging and other ceremonies. Also throughout the building and different areas in the building, we've incorporated murals and Indigenous art, as well as really wanting to make sure that Indigenous employees, and Grant mentioned this, had pathways to grow within the organization. So we did introduce an internship where we have somebody who's maybe has less job experience or is younger or has had more barriers to employment can be mentored as an Indigenous employee to grow. And then for our existing Indigenous staff that we're actively ensuring that we recruit more of, we created an Indigenous employee circle, which is a space where they can get together and have conversation, but also feed to me or other leadership changes that they're seeing that need to be made within the organization. In terms of that cultural safe space too, when we think about just, cultural and accessibility and what folks need, we also made sure that we added televisions in certain programming rooms so that there was a way to provide content that had voiceover and wasn't literacy heavy for those for whom that would be a barrier. And one of the key things in all of this work was to ensure that we are hearing from community. And so right now, actually, in a week, our lived experience advisory coordinator will be starting, and we're creating a group of folks who have lived experience both using Siloam and not using Siloam Mission to provide feedback on operations and on our housing strategy as we move forward. Really trying to live into that nothing about us without us. And that's a key part, I think, of being culturally safe and supportive.
Perfect. I like that you mentioned too, like folks that are staying with you and folks that are not. It's really critical. Moving into our next element then is person-centered care in shelter. When we're talking about person-centered care, we're referring to an approach that really prioritizes the individual needs, their preferences, and their circumstances, right? So it's about it involves treating each shelter guest with dignity and respect. And it's about taking the time to recognize their unique experiences, challenges, and strengths, and promoting their full participation in planning, problem solving, and decision making as it relates to the care, support, and rehousing journey, as opposed to just having a one-size-fits-all standard template or formula for each shelter guest. So it's not a one-size-fits-all, and the ultimate goal is about empowering people to and promote their well-being towards greater independence away from the shelter. And so practical ways to do that in your shelter can be about adopting a strength-based approach, right? So view the person as resourceful and resilient, filled with abilities, knowledge, not deficiencies. I think so many times we talk about the barriers, the challenges, which are legitimate, but we forget about the resiliencies, the assets, and the abilities that someone still has available to them to help improve their situation. We want to make sure that we're strength-based, and it's not only about positive things and avoiding the truth, right? But rather it's about acknowledging people do have difficulties that require attention, but know that there are resources and skills that the person possesses to tackle those difficulties, right? So you want to be able to recognize what is working well so it can be reproduced in other areas. And you want them to also be able to understand the future they see for themselves, not just their present situation. And so there's a diagram on the bottom there, speaking of Venn diagrams, is that we really see the person at the center where there's an opportunity to explore and acknowledge, two different types of strengths: the individual strengths, right? So their personal qualities, talents, skills, aspirations, and then the environmental strengths that they may not be thinking of as far as formal or informal resource support, formal or informal resources available to them, but also their social capital, so their relationships that they can draw on and the opportunities that kind of come with those. And then Tessa will talk about person-centered care at Siloam.
Yeah, so I think one of the things right off the hop that we needed to transition to when we changed to behavior-based entry was, instead of there is still moments where we need people to take a break from accessing Siloam. And so I kind of wanted to talk about how that works in a person-centered way. And again, it was hard to pick what to talk about where. So I think this also overlaps with trauma-informed, this also overlaps with harm reduction. But when we're thinking about that person-centered aspect, it's really about making sure that we have an opportunity to understand from that person's perspective why that behavior-based expectation was broken, And so we do this through engaging in a restorative circle. And again, just a fantastic team and services here that really led the creation of this and worked with community and best practice research to make it happen. So sitting with somebody, and I just had the opportunity to do this because I was an extra staff one day for the drop-in team when they needed someone, but like really sitting through and saying like what happened, and so like what happened that led to the break in service, but what happened for that person that actually led to the behavior. So an example just from the conversation I was in was, well, I got violent with somebody that was trying to make a donation and come into the building to make a donation. Well, what happened for that behavior for that person? And so this person talked about what had happened in their day before that. They talked about having used substances to a point that was kind of pushing them into, being less aware of themselves. It isn't something they would normally want to do. They're normally quite kind. We talked about what the impact of that behavior was and who was impacted by that behavior. We talked about what they could do differently when those precipitating factors were there. So like if you know that these things could lead to a behavior like this, how can you check in with staff? How can you get yourself in a space where you can make safer decisions? And how can we help them live into those expectations so that the return to service is faster in this model, but also that there's a conversation to just say, this is why that impact happened. So really important that every person has a chance to return if they're willing to engage in repair. Of course, in casework, all of our goals are already person-centered, and we're doing that work with folks one-on-one to say, what's the, like on your housing journey, what's the priority? Is the first priority ID? Is the first priority employment? Is the first priority actually maybe getting back to a community that you're from if Winnipeg's not your original community? How do we work with people on that aspect of being person-centered?
Perfect, thank you. Our next element is regarding providing services in a compassionate manner. And I thought I would start off this conversation by sharing a quote that actually Ian DeYoung from OrgCode used in a presentation more than 10 years ago when I was in a different role that just stuck with me. And it sticks with me now to this day and everything that I do in my work. And the word compassion comes from the Latin meaning to suffer with, right? And this quote here says, compassion is not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. It's a relationship between equals. Only when we know our own darkness well can we be present with the darkness of others. Compassion becomes real when we recognize our shared humanity. And I think we can't do this work in a compassionate manner if we're othering people, right? I'm the healer, you're wounded, I'm somehow different than you. So I need to have some self-awareness, and I need to recognize that shared humanity between us as we go through this journey together while you're in the shelter. But you'll also hear it oftentimes too, when we're talking about being more housing focused and low barrier, is that the goal is not to heal or fix people, right? So we're here to support people in a compassionate way to be able to get back to a successful housing outcome. And so practical ways to kind of serve people compassionately in your shelter can first, I think, make sure that staff are sensitive to power differential. And it's not to pretend between staff and guests that power differentials don't exist. That's not a reality, right? Just by the fact that one person is a service provider and the other one's a service recipient, there's some inherent power differentials. It'd be inauthentic to pretend like there's a blindness to that. So you want to be sensitive, though, through your use of language and terms and roles. So you want to name that power dynamic. So it might be helpful to explicitly acknowledge the power differential with shelter guests, or if you're a housing-based case manager, to do that. This can really open up a dialogue between you and shelter guests, and be able to address it and make the client or your guests feel more at ease. You want to be able to use inclusive language like we and us, as opposed to you and I, involved in your conversations. You want to involve guests in decision making and promoting co-creation and development of tasks. You want to be able to respect their choices, right? So support the guest's right to make their own decisions, even if they differ from what you might recommend. So you want to reinforce that they are in control of their own journey. but also ensure they're making informed decisions. And you want to be able to reflect the possible outcomes of each decision. You can also ask them too to say like, hey, there's this power differential, but are there things that how we meet or what I talk about or the language that I use that will help, if I change certain words, will help minimize that, or where we meet will help minimize that. The other way to maybe serve compassionately is to not jump to conclusions, right? So really want to pause and reflect and engage with genuine curiosity by asking shelter guests open-ended questions, showing genuine interest, gather more information by actively listening and give your full attention to them and be fully present. Maybe taking the time to listen will help you understand the difference between motivation versus confidence and preparedness. So put yourself in their situation. I think far too often we jump to the conclusion that when someone's not doing something, they're not motivated or they don't care about it. But there might be actually other things like they don't feel prepared or have the confidence level, or it might be happening in a way that they're not comfortable with. So be open to listening versus jumping to that conclusion or that too quick of an assumption. You want to avoid judgment. You want to ensure that your body language, your tone, and words that you communicate safety and respect with all those things. So instead, you saying things like, you really shouldn't do that. Let's say something happening in the shelter, or that's inappropriate, or you made a bad decision. You may want to try something like, how did that help you achieve your goal? When you did that, how did that impact you? What was the outcome when you did that? Did that create the result you were hoping for? And regardless of how someone presents, to serve compassionately also means to find strengths in them. So even if the guest cannot identify strengths within themselves or has difficulty, because let's be honest, sometimes folks might internalize a lot of that deficiency-based language and apply it to themselves. We want to reflect back to them what you have observed, right? So ideas could be things that have helped them survive while they were homeless. How do you replicate those same skills when trying to be rehoused and completing those rehousing tasks? And the last one that I highlighted in bold and red is this idea of practicing radical acceptance, right? And when we talk about radical acceptance, it's really just a practice of a conscious effort to acknowledge and honor difficult situations and emotions, that they exist. By fully accepting things as they are, instead of ignoring them or pretending that they're not there or trying to wish them away or the situation was different, we can then take a critical step in moving through that difficult experience uh, with more meaning. So, but radical acceptance is not like we approve of the current situation. We accept that you're experiencing homelessness, but we don't approve of it as like an inevitability that will continue to exist forever. Or an example here is that we accept the situation that you've experienced abuse and trauma, but we do not approve of that abuse and trauma. It is just a relevant part of your life. Radical acceptance is not sitting back and giving up. So an example can be something like when cancer patients do like acceptance-based behaviors amongst cancer patients, right? It's like, oh, I have cancer, so I might as well do any treatment or anything recommendations that the doctor makes. It's an inevitability. Why bother trying? And you can see that probably with shelter guests who have been homeless for a long time, right? I've been housed before. I've had negative outcomes. Why would I bother going through that again? I just accept the fact that I'm just a homeless person. I'm not a housed person. I'm a homeless person for the rest of my life. And radical acceptance is not specific to just people we serve, right? Want to acknowledge that workers struggle with acceptance too. Like I think before organizations started to incorporate more behavior-based practices, we kind of just really struggled with accepting the fact that people use drugs, or really accept the fact that sometimes people have a difficult time managing their stress, and it comes out in different weird ways at times. So when you can use radical acceptance is really about as long as stress, sadness, or frustration and grief is present. There's always going to be opportunity to practice radical acceptance, and I'm sure there's no shortage of that in our day-to-day work in shelters. So you can think about that after a significant loss, when it comes to things like anger management, when it comes time to think about like how we talk about improving sense of self-worth. And this is a big one for me that I've seen with a lot of folks, is struggling with the what is versus what I wish it was. Um, and we see that for people. I'm not satisfied with my current situation. I, but I have to acknowledge that it exists, but I need to think about where I need to go next. And so now Tessa's going to talk about how you set up your teams to be compassionate.
Yeah, and I think just that last note that you talked about is the acceptance of what is versus what I wish it was is a big part for staff also. Like we wish folks could be housed, we wish folks could be well. We see people kind of ride that roller coaster of wellness and be in a really good headspace for a while and then have a slip that changes something in their life. Or reacts to a change in their life, and that's all on our heart because hopefully your team loves people, as like our team does, and feels all of that for them. So we talk a lot about how heart work is hard work and how that translates into needing to take care of our staff to ensure that they have the emotional space to be compassionate. So this can look like making sure people are like well trained and kind of understand some of those systems issues so that they don't feel like they've personally failed someone because their housing has fallen through, but rather to recognize that it might take a couple tries for somebody's housing to pan out. Or that, depending on the context and the lack of social housing, it's going to be harder to house people. Also making sure that there's downtime for teams to just connect with each other. So, they can have the relationships that when in a moment they know that they have each other's back, they have safe space to go chat with one another. We are, continuing to look at circles for staff with lived experience to connect. Opportunities for staff to connect from different equity deserving groups so that they have space to kind of debrief in a good way. So really making sure that, access to good benefits, access to EAP, all of that is talked about openly as something that staff can and we want staff to access to take care of themselves. I think the other thing that's really helpful for us and builds empathy is those success stories. So how do we lift up lived experiences, voices within our team? We're so lucky to have so many folks working with us to deliver services who in the past have accessed services either here or in other spaces that can help make decisions and help us make healthier decisions for folks currently experiencing homelessness or currently using services. So how do we lift up those voices? How do we make sure we bring in external lived experience experts to talk to the team? So community who want to, in the right ways, can share their journey in that strengths-based and trauma-informed way. So not sharing it from a perspective, of having to reshare, but rather sharing it from a perspective where they feel empowered and want to share. And that's been really key. I think the other thing that's just so important when we think about compassion and we think about that self-care aspect is really emulating a leadership that takes care of itself. And so if you're leading an organization where folks are caring for others, and you're, kind of always jumping in or always doing that, like if you're burning yourself out, you're creating that burnout culture from the top. And so really blessed to have a leadership team who, talks about, hey, I'm actually going to my counselor this afternoon to talk about work stuff, or hey, I'm going to ceremony because work's been hard lately, or hey, I'm doing a wiping away tears ceremony and offering grief and memorials and stuff for when we lose community members on site. So staff know that having feelings about this work is totally valid, totally normal, and that giving work time to process those feelings is what we want for them.
I'm also conscious of the time, and I know that we said that we do the 75 minutes max, but I'm going to say let's give ourselves 90 minutes max. If you can only stay for 75, stay for 75. If you can stay for 90, so we have time for questions, let's stay for 90. So the last element that we're going to talk about is assertive outreach in shelter. And so when we're talking about assertive outreach, we're referring to not a passive, but a really kind of active or proactive and persistent approach to engaging individuals that are experiencing homelessness and that are in our shelter. Particularly those that may be reluctant or unable to seek help on their own. And I think that Tessa can probably attest to this, is to say, if we sit in our office and wait for people to come to us, there might be some people that will come, but there's going to be a whole big group that will not. And so to be a housing focus and low barrier shelter means that it's not a passive environment. The staff are out on the floor intentionally seeking to engage with shelter guests regardless of presenting needs or length of stay. And so practical ways to do that, as I put here in quotes, is to get out of your staff glass bubble. I've been to plenty of shelters where I see a lot of people, shelter guests, in common spaces and a whole bunch of staff in a glass bubble. And so we can't be engaging people if we're not physically present with them. So get out on the floor and, maybe do something as simple as, I'll steal from the DI, is conduct like planting the housing seed conversations. So doing things like keeping it small, like, what would you have for breakfast your first morning in your new place? Who's the first guest you'd like to have over? What would you put in your living room? Really basic things like that. It gets them to think that, right, this is a space to talk about these things. You want to be able to discuss housing options. So what would housing look like for you? Where should we start looking? You may want to start initiating housing assessments, so determine their housing needs, so type, location, and address barriers. So maybe there's incomplete documentation or missing ID or credit issues. Start developing some housing plans, starting with maybe some more short-term goals, and then build off that and create some momentum to complete some longer term or more ambitious goals, and then even more long-term goals once housed. But you can create also some designated staff leads to work with specific shelter guests, especially depending on rapport or time of day when they seem to be motivated to do some of these things. And then assist with housing interviews, or connect the shelter guest to someone who can be mobile with them in the community to act as a kind of go-between between them and the landlord. But I really want to emphasize this, is that we cannot be assertive in our outreach unless we're physically present and proximate and with shelter guests actively throughout the day in the space where they live instead of in our offices. Tessa?
Yeah. So one of the things for us in terms of assertive outreach is really making sure that we're housing focused in all conversations. So we actually went through our job descriptions and rewrote them to include a housing focused element in as many of them as we could make sense, so that people knew that that expectation was a part of their job, no matter their role. But some of the questions that we're asking is, are we proximate? So are we in conversation with community members? Are we building rapport and understanding? So when I'm connecting with community members, I'll often, depending on the level of rapport with them, joke about like, oh, well, I'm actually really sad to see you still here. I'm really excited about when you're going to get housing. Like, how's that going for you? We also leave information about housing and resources for folks on their beds. We have poster boards. We actually created a website so that when folks access computers here, the home screen website is like housing supports, income supports, what services Siloam offers, so that it's regularly cued that housing journey is a part of what we're about. We make sure staff share that they're happy to help around housing, income, and other supports, and that they kind of have conversational guides and some training on those quick housing, like quick touches. But one of the things in terms of that data-driven aspect, and Paul and Julianne are in the webinar, they've really spearheaded this here, is keeping track of who we've talked to and when. And if somebody hasn't been chatted to with a while for a housing check-in, which is just hey, we're really trying to make sure that you're on your housing journey. We want to make sure you have the supports that you need, that they're prioritized for a deliberate check-in. So new people are top priority. And then folks who've been here for a while, we make sure again that just like ever so often, we're deliberately finding them to have that housing focused conversation on top of the entire team having housing focused language, and building that into the way that they interact with community. So that can be everything from, I know recently somebody had a viewing of housing unit, and I talked about, oh, well, I'm like really excited. I heard you want a plant. And so we have some plants, and we made sure that they got a plant for when they were ready to move in. And we said, well, I'll take care of the plant for you till you get your apartment. So really just making sure that they know that we want to be a process that people come to when they're experiencing houselessness to move into housing, as opposed to a destination where people land and stay for a long time.
Great. Thank you. So those are all the elements. You're not expected to have them all memorized and all practical ways to do them. As I mentioned, you'll get the slides so you can always look back on them when you're trying to think about how to incorporate some of these things potentially into your shelter. The other thing too is that you have an active relationship with me as the coordinator for CSTN. So if there's some follow-up support that you're looking for or want to further the conversation around some of these things, around the how-to, please reach out. But I'm just going to leave you with some reflection questions before we go to questions for Tessa. Is just to think about when you leave here today, right? So as shelter operators, which service orientation elements do we feel we're delivering well in our shelter? Which elements require some improvement and maybe increased attention from our organization? Is there any additional training requirements for our staff to feel comfortable in delivering services in this way? I think Tessa touched on that a few times about the importance of training to create greater comfort and competency. What specific policies or practices need to change to make our environment and services more aligned with the service orientation reviewed today? Do we want to consult with people with lived experience and who are living the experience, both present and former guests? And then have we created multiple channels where shelter guests can provide feedback on our shelter practices? So you'll have those reflection questions in the slides. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I want to go to, I have some preset questions that I can ask Tessa, but I want to see, Robin, if we have any questions from our audience.
Thanks so much, Grant. Actually, we only have one question in the Q&A about sharing slides, which of course we will get that out there. But that was about it. So not much else come through the Q&A. So folks, just a reminder, feel free to select that option down at the bottom. I don't believe chat is functioning, so please do use the Q&A if you have a question you would like to throw in.
While we're waiting to see if any questions come in, Tessa, I'll ask you a question to get the ball rolling. So how's it been going since you've introduced these changes?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's really interesting is when we introduced behavior-based, we actually saw a reduction in the violence that was happening against staff. And so it's interesting because I think there's still, as staff go into something new and a bit of uncharted territory, they talk about it as though there might be more, but luckily we're keeping those statistics. And so we can say, well, actually it has been reduced. But you know, there is maybe more high emotion, or there's more needs to de-escalate because folks are being asked to live into a behavior-based model because folks might be experiencing psychosis or using substances in the space. But the actual violence against staff has decreased by about 40% at the last count. So that's been huge. And the other thing that we have noticed is more, you know, community members who can access our services, obviously. So that's created operational strain in terms of needing to up our staffing level and needing to up the amount of food and other services that we're offering. But what we've also really noticed is the capacity, I think, for our team to have a common understanding. So when it's behavior-based and it's clear, it's like we are safe, respectful, we're focused on needs, here's how we respond when somebody's stepping outside of that. We are all responding the same way. And so it's reduced some of the tensions that existed between our drop-in team and our shelter team around, you know, favoritism with community members. Well, that community member got in when they clearly weren't sober, but well, because I knew that they would behave. Okay, well then let's just move to behavior as the regulation. And that's really created a more cohesion within our team. That's been a really, really valuable. And I think one of the other things that happened with a lot of these changes is actually we had a team of caseworkers that were working from a trauma-informed, person-centered, strengths-based lens for a long time. But as more of the organization takes on that approach, we've drastically increased the amount of folks that we're housing every year because we're able to, really prioritize that housing focus across everything that we're doing. We're really, we still have some folks that unfortunately have been here for multiple years that we're working to house and trying to figure out what that looks like. But some of that best practice in housing focus is also like, don't spend all of your time there and not spend time with the folks that might be a quicker win. And so how do we balance that with the data tracking to be able to make sure that we're checking in with people equitably and not just focusing on the highest area of need where we might actually have the lowest rate of success, and making sure that all individuals have access to the supports that they need. And we're really on track if we think about Ian de Jong's kind of stats of how long are people in shelter, how successful is their rehousing. and those types of things. Like we've really noticed now we have a full year of data, and I think we might have opportunities to share some of that data in the future with this group. But we really are on track with those kind of what are the common statistics. And that's been really interesting because we never tracked that before. So really embarking on that data journey, and happy to share how we've been doing that and how that's been working for us. But that's been really, really important.
You know, I appreciate too that you touched on the piece around safety, because so many groups that I talk to is saying like, well, how do we, low barrier just sounds like greater safety issues for our staff. And when I talk to shelter leaders who have actually are further along in this journey around being lower barrier, they actually say like, yeah, it actually reduces the high risk situations, or the higher risk situations, because shelter guests are not just seeing staff when you're just addressing a problem, but rather are developing more of a relationship. And so there's opportunity to problem solve through conflict, as opposed to just addressing it only when stuff kind of comes up and being very reactionary. So that's kind of cool to hear. I don't know. Oh,
There are questions now.
there are questions.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So being low barrier and harm reduction focus, have you encountered shelter guests consistently under the influence and participation in your program was limited, of slow going, and how did you navigate that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's folks here that, and so for us, it's really about making sure that our team understands the stages of change, and where people are at in their change journey. Like somebody might not be interested in having a housing conversation with us. And so our job is just to make sure that we continually bring it up with them so that the day they are ready, they're prompted. But we do have folks that are like, yeah, I'm just coming here for food, and I don't want to, have or I'm just coming here to sleep and I don't want to have the conversation. And so we'll continue to bring it up to them, like respectfully, obviously, and then just say, well, when you're ready, we'd love to chat about your housing journey, or when you're ready, we'd love to, figure out what your next step is. I think one of the pieces around participation is that there's no programming here that's actually required participation. So the people that are participating in programs are ideally the people who want to be in that program, and are therefore, like, the rest of the program is not slowed down because someone's in the space who is not actually interested. And it is just like they might just come here to access basic needs like clothing and showers and laundry and food and a place to sleep, and not engage in programming around anger management or community wellness or employment. So those things are all voluntary to really give agency to that person. And then that agency actually builds their buy-in in the program.
Great. I think also too, you kind of touched on this a bit. The second question here I see from Andrea Ann is, are there certain trainings that you consistently offer to staff and recommend for other shelters within Canada to consider taking on? And with this, how do you ensure that all your staff are getting the training?
Yeah, so we introduced a training and development coordinator. And so he tracks training, but also responds to training needs. So for example, with a lot of our staff who might have had previous barriers to employment or might have been lived experience, we recognize that there's like a huge need for computer literacy, because we want them to do well here. And part of doing well here is making sure that you can check your emails, and do other things on the computer. And so now we're introducing that as a training for our staff. So I think part of it is like the training needs to also make sure that it's meeting the staff need. But yeah, we regularly offer training on what the behavior-based model is. And I mentioned to Grant already that we're happy to kind of share links to that because some of that is virtual. So that'll come out in your package after this. We regularly share trainings on de-escalation. Professional boundaries is a huge one, especially because we have folks now on our staff team who maybe used to access services with community that they're now serving. So how do we do that in a good way? And what does it mean to have those boundaries? A lot of, assist, et cetera. We're working right now on a pilot project to do a different version of nonviolent crisis intervention that's more shelter oriented and really works on being proximate and doing prevention as opposed to always being in that reactionary state of de-escalation. And I think the training aspect in terms of that, how do you coordinate it and have someone who's kind of in charge of coordinating that really helps. But how do we also make sure that managers see this value, and so that they're making time for their team? The other thing that we introduced is actually we're open 24/7 generally, but in the good weather, we close on Thursdays in the summertime to just have training time, just from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. But that 5-hour window to really concentrate on the team needs that training space. And unfortunately, we don't have enough funding to just have a second team that could come in. But that helps the team have space to have conversations and talk through things as they come up.
Great. And the other question for me is about onboarding process. You kind of touched on that because you touched on like onboarding and then continuous training, right?
Mhm.
So I think we've kind of answered that. There's another question though about can you give examples of behavior-based training that you used with your staff?
Yeah, so we worked with an organization locally called Momenta, who helps develop behavior-based programs for shelter spaces, as well as other programming spaces that are working with folks in populations where there's trauma and vulnerability. And so we have a training, like a video training that they've done. And then we also have time for staff to go through the behavior-based matrix to say, okay, like if this is our responses and this is how we work through that program. And again, we can kind of share those when the slides come out from this presentation. I think one of the core things in general is that we have why behavior-based, and that happens for everybody, and then the how of it, right? So it's not just the like, why are we introducing this and like go try to figure it out. It's really laid out for folks. This is how you follow it and this is how it works. So that again, whether I'll go back to John and I think I said Jane, like if they're having behaviors on a different day with a different team, they're getting the same responses. So that for them, that consistency is there. And that's really key with behavior-based, programming space.
Great. The other thing too is circle back to even like an earlier question about like if things feel like they're too slow going with some folks. If folks are interested, one of the upcoming sessions is actually going to be about how to use motivational interviewing, assertive engagement, and understanding of stages of change when working with folks in shelter who might be pre-contemplative or contemplative about changing their housing status. So it's coming up. We know that can be a challenge for shelter staff. I'm seeing here too, what sort of mechanisms do you use to get feedback from your shelter guests? How do you incorporate feedback into your programs? And the second part is, have you witnessed any long stays for participants in shelters? And how have you supported to have successful exits within a short time frame? So I guess the first part is, how do you get feedback from guests?
Yeah. So one of the key feedback mechanisms is we do community town halls. So we know that kind of only catches folks that might be willing to speak in a larger environment. We have posters both in shelter and in drop-in that kind of walk through, if you have an issue, what the process is to bring it forward, and how you can escalate that to leadership if you feel like you're not getting the response you need from those staff. Staff explain that to folks when they bring something forward as well. We do a lot of sitting down with folks to do more kind of lengthy qualitative interviews. So we've done a concerted effort of that in a couple of years ago to help develop our new strategic plan. So we sat down with over 78 folks accessing services at that time. We paid them for their time with a grocery store gift card, just to sit down and say, okay, what are we doing that's working? What are we doing that's not working? We're now engaging in that same practice to inform our housing strategy, as well as to inform some STBBI research and education work that we're doing out of our clinic. And we're about to create a lived experience advisory council and a role there. And that person's role will be to build relationships with community one-on-one, but also to bring a group together to kind of give that feedback, and that group is connected to community as part of the kind of baseline of that terms of reference. So those are some of those ways. We also have created, I think one of the things that's been valuable is like, how do we allow staff to give feedback? So we've created anonymous channels for staff to ask questions about like, hey, we call it Friday Fact or Fiction. So every time there's a rumor or something or a weird question, I'll answer it on Fridays. And that just gives people a vehicle to anonymously be like, this is weird and I heard this, and us a way to answer it. And so because they're going to hear feedback from community because they built those relationships and they're proximate. And so that's a key part of it too, is just, community need to know that they can take something to the person they're the most comfortable with, and that will then be addressed in whatever way makes sense. The second part of that question, yes, we definitely witness long stays. And I see another question of, do we have time frame expectations? And we don't. And so we did away with that in part because there's less than 1,000 units in Winnipeg available at the cost that people get for rent with EIA. And those aren't vacant either. Our vacancy rate for low income housing is well under 1%. And so we just didn't think it was fair to say, go find housing when that housing doesn't exist in our city. Moreover, we know that it can damage that working relationship with somebody or damage that person's journey to breach the trust with them to say, actually, our service is no longer available to you. So, part of this is figuring out, okay, here's the best practice. And then how does that work in the context you're in? And so we understand that there are some research out there that talks about timeframe expectations or limitations. We have those in certain programs, but we don't have them in basic access to services. So in our employment program, for example, in the first 6 months, if you're not working on your housing, you won't get your contract renewed for your next 6 months because we need you to be actively working towards housing as a goal to be in the employment program. In our art program, it's the same thing. So our programs where, again, that participation is voluntary says housing is a part of this program and every program has a housing focus. But if it's just access to, hey, I need a safe place to sleep and it's -40, we're not going to put a time limit there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the stuff that I've seen from Canada and the US, it talks about, this idea of like, no matter what, it's voluntary engagement. And so sometimes when we put like arbitrary length of stays that leads to like unsheltered homelessness, we're potentially just adding further to that re-traumatization of that
Totally.
individual. And so, but I can get it to say folks would be like, well, Grant's been here for 40 days and he's told me to F off 40 days in a row when every time I talk to him about housing. And I said this in the previous webinar, I said, well, right, it's not that Grant isn't buying the product the right way. It's that we're maybe selling something to Grant in a way that he's not interested in buying. So you're trying to use that more like customer service approach of trying to understand like what is making Grant so discerning, what's holding him back from participating, and then how do I adjust my engagement and my approach in order for it to feel more appealing to Grant. Now I know there's also sometimes people will say, well, we have financial constraints because of length of stays, like especially if you're a smaller community that's using, I don't know, like emergency motel accommodations can be quite expensive. And so those are difficult decisions, but I think that they're ones that are driven by a fiscal limitation, not necessarily just because you decided the person's not engaging enough.
If I could add there, I think, and part of this is because this has been new for us over the last 3 years or so, in terms of formalizing these processes. Again, it was alive and well with leadership within the organization before that, but maybe not the buy-in from the top and the board level to make those changes in the same way that there is now. We had a story of a gentleman who'd been accessing services and staying overnight in the shelter repeatedly for quite a while. And wasn't engaging when we went one-on-one to talk to him and say, hey, like, do you want a housing focused check-in? Can we start having that conversation? Just kind of wasn't like involved yet. We've started to leave on a semi-regular basis little notes on people's beds. This is what, here's what casework is, here's what you can access, like we can help you do tax returns, etc. And it was like, oh, this person was like, oh, actually, I haven't done my taxes in a really long time. I'm interested in doing my taxes. I wasn't actually interested in having a conversation about housing. And then because that tax return came through and they got quite a lot of money back, then all of a sudden their hope for housing changed. So it might be that it's something else that has to happen first for that person to believe that housing is possible for them. And I think from tax return to housing, it was like a 2-week window where we've been trying with this person for, I think it was over 2 or 3 months to have a conversation and we're just getting nowhere. So it's also about, what are the other steps before housing that might feel less intimidating or more accessible? And how do you build in the knowledge that you'll help there too? And then that can lead to a successful housing journey.
Yeah, and I think you hit on something really important there, is that we mentioned it earlier about this transformational work in shelters, is that change is hard. Changing human behavior is hard. So not just for us as operating shelters, but also for our guests to change and think about things differently, including things like participating in some kind of rehousing activity. Like I'm supposed to wear these glasses and you can see me, I struggle with keeping them on my face, and I've had the prescription for 2 years. Incrementally, I'm getting better, but the thing hasn't stuck yet around how do I wear them consistently. So I would say there is a certain amount of respectful, but still persistent,
Yeah.
continuous engagement with someone instead of just writing off the conversation altogether. I am very mindful of the time. I will cap it at a firm 90. I know we went 15 minutes over. Before I give my thank yous out to everybody, I just want to say, I'll put it in the email that goes out. If you want to get involved in a research and evaluation project around shelter transformation, we're doing this project with the Calgary Drop-In Org Code and the research folks at University of Calgary, specifically Katrina Mullaney and her team. There is a confidential online survey that you can do as a shelter staff member to talk about, all the things that we kind of talked about today, like what do you think the barriers are of becoming housing focused and more low barrier? What are you worried about? What are the opportunities? What resources do you think you need? It's really, really short survey. It's done anonymously, so you can be honest. And the more people who complete the survey, the more robust this research can be. So look for that link in the email. Okay. Thanks everybody for your attendance, your participation. I love the questions that came in. Tessa, thank you so much for your time and everything that you contributed to today. I want to thank Robin for assisting us on the back end with stuff, and the IT people who helped us in the scramble prep just before this, and Sandra Clarkson for providing introduction from the CSTN steering committee. Again, everything will be sent out via email in the next week or so, so keep an eye out for that. A reminder, our next webinar is September 25th on diversion and shelter intake. There'll be more stuff coming out to promote that, and you can find the link. So everybody, have a wonderful, wonderful Wednesday, and reach out if you need help with anything. And again, big thank you to everybody for your participation.
Thanks, everyone.